Join me for a conversation with game designer and writer Ryan Schoon.
Welcome to DiceGeeks.com Tabletop RPG Show. Level up your RPG campaigns by filling yourself with stories and knowledge. Explore topics from archaeology to film history to writing to literature and much, much more. This is DiceGeeks.com Tabletop RPG Show.
Welcome to the show. My name is Matt, and I am your host. This is the podcast where we learn how to become better game masters and role players by filling ourselves with stories and knowledge. All right, guys, if you want some resources that will help you run better tabletop role-playing game sessions and campaigns, please check out DiceGeeks.com. But now, here's today's interview. My guest today is writer and game designer Ryan Schoon. Ryan, welcome to the show.
Hey, welcome to you, I guess, as well, or welcome to me. Thanks for having me, Matt. It's exciting to be here.
Yeah, no problem. It is awesome. How were you first introduced to tabletop role-playing games?
Oh, like the actual... So there, this is actually a funny story. The first tabletop role-playing game I ever had, I was young. I was very young, and I was at the library. And they had this game... Call of Cthulhu, one of the old editions, and they let me check it out. Nice. I was a kid, by the way. I brought that game home, and I was like instantly immersed because I played a lot of the Choose Your Own Adventure book. Like I read through a lot of those Choose Your Own Adventure books, and I love that idea of storytelling. And I was a big reader even at that young of age. And this game was very different, right? Like this was a world I'd never been exposed to of like this horror and supernatural. Of course, when my parents saw what I had and they flipped through a few pages, they immediately made me take it back to the library and return it. Oh, no. They were not a fan. But my parents, they weren't awful about that kind of thing. They didn't like the subject matter of Call of Cthulhu. So when I was kind of sad about it, they took me to the bookstore and I was able to pick out a different game, a different role-playing game. And I chose the West End game Star Wars D6, which that was actually my first entry. I didn't really understand how to play it at that young of an age, but I knew how to read it. And I had and I knew I kind of made a character. And that was kind of what got me started in role-playing games. I actually still have a collection of quite a few of those old Star Wars D6 manuals and adventures. And this is maybe a little embarrassing. There was a very short-lived Men in Black role-playing game as well. Which I had, and I played that with my little sister and some friends at school. We played a lot of the Men in Black role-playing game as well. So those are kind of what built my foundation, and that was long before I discovered, Dungeons and Dragons, or even rediscovered Call of Cthulhu at an older age and realized, how big of a game that actually was, how much of a coincidence it was that I just happened to pull Call of Cthulhu off of the shelves of the library. So that's kind of where I started with the RPG world, and I've loved it ever since.
Yeah. Okay. Well, that's great. And as regular listeners of the podcast will know that Star Wars D6 is one of my favorite games of all time. And
yeah, what a great game. I still have my book right behind me.
Oh my gosh, I got mine right over here. Yep, I got 1987 first edition. Yeah, I grabbed them off the shelf.
I think mine is second edition, but yeah.
Oh, nice. Yeah, and it's been my pleasure also to interview on the show. I've interviewed Bill Slavacek, who wrote the source book.
Oh, that's awesome.
And that's a total geek out episode. I just
sure.
I didn't even know what I was asking him anymore at that point because it was just so cool. But that is just such a great game, and I have a ton of material from the late 80s and kind of up into the early 90s there. Tons of material from that game left over because it's just so awesome. I still have the Mos Eisley map from the one adventure, the manhunt. What is it?
Oh, nice.
Tanaween manhunt. I still have that map, and it's awesome because you can use it in any Star Wars role-playing game.
Definitely still use it.
Yeah. And now you got one on me, though. I didn't realize there was a Men in Black role-playing game.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, that one. Yeah, that
I
one
think
got me.
very few people probably do realize that. I mean, outside of whoever worked on it, I think that might have been West End Games as well.
Huh.
Because I think it, like, if I remember correctly, because I went back to that same section of the bookstore at a later date and I saw that they had Men in Black, and I was a big Men in Black fan. Like that movie too, like really. That was like my Star Wars being a kid. Like I actually saw Men in Black before I saw Star Wars. Like I love the world that movie presented. I had poster of Men in Black in my room. I had the Men in Black soundtrack with Will Smith rapping on it. So like, and I was still a kid at this time, right? So
Yeah,
being able to play in that world, like that kind of showed me what it is to be able to like, experience these worlds in a different way, or like actually be part of that story.
yeah, no, absolutely, and you are correct. It was West End Games.
Yeah.
Wow, I did not know they put out a Men in Black one. Yeah, that was.
I still have that book as well.
Yeah, nice. Now a lot of people don't know they also put out a Indiana Jones role playing game, which I played some, and I have don't believe I have ever met somebody else who's played West End's Indiana Jones.
I have not played it, but it does live in infamy. I mean, we have, it's kind of the butt of a lot of jokes in the RPG industry still to this day. So,
yeah, that is interesting. But West End Games. I've also interviewed a couple people who've worked at West End Games, and there's a lot of interesting stories there.
I'm sure.
That come out of that company. Really, I think kept the kind of the torch alive for tabletop role playing games while D&D was going through kind of a weird phase, and customizable card games kind of blew up the industry.
Oh, for sure. Those. That's what I played. West End Games, and I played Magic. Those were the things that I played. Growing up. I didn't even know about D&D until I got to college. Actually, that was the first time I encountered people that were like actively playing D&D and got me roped into playing D&D. And that was my freshman year of college was the first time I actually played D&D, and that was right when 3.5 came out.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Okay. And what was your experience then discovering Dungeons and Dragons?
I mean, it was great. My GM, the guy that I lived down the hall from me, had been playing D&D his whole life, and his dad played D&D, and he works with Adventures League, and like, so he's like, I would say a talented GM, a very good GM. His name's Jeremy Arnold. If he's listening, hi Jeremy. And he does Adventures League stuff now. So I think I was a little spoiled also by being able to, like, my first experience with D&D was somebody that was very familiar with the game. And also grew up playing it. So I had a really great first experience. We had some really great campaigns all throughout my college years. So yeah, it was a lot of fun.
Yeah, that's great. And now, being introduced to tabletop role playing games, and then you're saying you had a really great game master, a really great dungeon master.
Yeah.
Did you kind of take up the mantle and start running your own games at some point?
I mean, I definitely did. Like in high school, I used to run, like I said, I would run the Star Wars game for my friends. I would run the Men in Black game. And eventually the one I got into running in college was Shadowrun. So I played a lot of D&D, and then I ran Shadowrun for my friends on my own, right? So those were kind of the two games I played a lot back and forth for college. I have been the DM for D&D, especially like a lot of one shots I'll pop in, but it's actually probably one of the systems that I have DM'd the least. Especially compared to I DM'd a huge Shadowrun campaign in college. So
nice.
That was a lot of hours.
Yeah, no, I can imagine. This is one of the holes in my gaming. I've never officially played Shadowrun. I've toyed with the book, wrestled with it,
exactly.
dreamed about it, had nightmares over it.
It is a wrestle. I'll say that. Running that game was I ran, I think it was second edition was what was out at the time, and I still have my second edition copy is taped together in multiple places, but I had just sheets and sheets of notes, like how to run different, like hacking and like, all the different like mini games that would happen within Shadowrun. That game is still a beast to run. And now I feel like I can run anything. Like if you can run Shadowrun, well, you can run any game. Like there's very few games out there that are as mechanically intensive as Shadowrun.
Yeah, and that's kind of leads into a follow-up question. I was going to say, what did you learn by running Shadowrun? Well,
so Shadowrun is a really, really tough game to DM. And I think one of the reasons it's so tough is because unlike games like D&D, where you don't split the party. In Shadowrun, you always split the party because you have characters performing these very different roles. You have the rigger that's out in the truck controlling the drones. You have the hacker who's not even present. They're hacking from a remote location. You have the guy that likes to be the sniper that's, three buildings down. So these characters are all spread out, and often they're doing very different things. So the person that's hacking is playing their own little hacking mini game, while the mage is maybe in the astral plane fighting against astral security, while you actually have like the street samurai going into the building, taking out the actual physical guards, and being able to balance all of these so that it doesn't become like the hacker show for 45 minutes straight. That's a skill that I really had to learn. And I was kind of thrown into the deep end of like, how do I manage this? Luckily, we actually, we had the internet at that time. So I was able, that was a great resource of like going to these forums and learning as much as I can about running Shadowrun. And that's where I got a lot of my, cheat sheets and little like guides on like, almost like creating my own GM screen of like how to keep these things running in a way that every character kind of got their own screen time while still doing these very different tasks. And yeah, it was a bit of a challenge. And there were probably times where some players were getting a little bored waiting for their turns to come back around, but that is a little bit of the nature of Shadowrun. Yeah.
And do you have any specific advice? Maybe some people who are running some games and, for dividing the party, how do you keep it interesting for everybody?
So I think one of the things that I've always said about games is you really have to keep shining the spotlight on players. And that's something that a term that's been thrown around for years, like that concept of like shining the spotlight, especially when you have players that are reluctant to jump in, because especially in a game like Shadowrun, you can have one character who just wants to dominate the scene, and it's important for you to break and shine the light onto somebody else. And the other thing I realized or learned about running Shadowrun that is super important is keeping the pacing and the tone consistent. Even when some of these tasks maybe are more exciting than others, you need to make every role feel exciting, whether it's just the next role of a hack or if it's like the street samurai, a jitsu draw taking down the boss. Like both of those things have to feel exciting for those players. And there has to be stakes involved in every role, even the boring ones. And you can't let the pace drag. Like you need to just like keep jumping, even if it means like you snap to a character just for a few seconds. Hey, this hack is happening. What are you doing? There's a guy running down the hall. Okay, you're taking cover. Let's pause. Let's go over to the mage in the astral plane. You need to bounce around. And sometimes that means giving people just little, snippets of a turn, but it does keep them engaged because you do keep coming back to them more often, even if you're not coming back to them for long periods of time. And that might not work for every player, but that did work in our group. It kind of kept that cinematic feel of, those like cut scenes or the montage where you're bouncing across all the different players. And so doing techniques like that, I think even help in D&D when I don't really get worried when people are like, we're going in 6 different directions. It's like, okay, I can manage that. I've been here before. Right.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, no, that's great. I think that's some great advice. I think it is important always to acknowledge people and stuff. And then, even with, like you said, even with like a little bit of a turn, just like check in with them, try to make something exciting. No, I think that's great advice.
Also on that same note, Shadowrun was the first game that taught me it's okay sometimes to just make things up, because when you're in those moments and you're in a really tense situation, the thing that's going to break that is going and flipping through a 300-page rule book trying to find one specific rule. Mm-hmm. So some gamers might be okay with that pause. I hate that pause. It's like, okay, let me just go with my gut, tell you what I think. We can look up the rule later if it's really important. Mm-hmm. But if it's like one of those one and done rules, like how exactly does this one specific thing work? If you know the game well enough, you can make an educated guess, right? And sometimes you're right, sometimes you're wrong. But it doesn't matter if you're wrong, as long as the game keeps moving forward and everybody is still having fun.
Yeah. No, I agree. Sadly, it took me a long time to realize that was okay in role-playing games. But
it's gotta be.
Yeah, it's gotta be. Yeah. Once I learned that, then I was just like, oh, okay. This is fine. And we can work with this stuff now. We can work with this now. No, that sounds really awesome. But now, of course, number of people are exposed to tabletop role-playing games. Some of them keep playing, some of them go off. Mm-hmm. But you were exposed to tabletop role-playing games, and then you've begun writing for tabletop role-playing games and designing some tabletop role-playing games.
True.
So how does that kind of come about from there? So you're running games, but now you've started designing and writing.
Yeah, so it was actually the advent of Kickstarter that got me into the industry. So back when Kickstarter started, what was that, like 2014 or 15? Whenever the birth of Kickstarter came, I saw all these people just putting their ideas onto Kickstarter and, making money off of them. And so this was the early days, the Wild West of Kickstarter. I don't know that I could have done this now, but I got together with my roommate at the time who was running a D&D campaign in his own homebrew world. And I said, why don't we just put this world up, on Kickstarter? Why don't we just make this a book and sell this campaign and send it out to everybody? Of course, we bit off way more than we could chew. We decided we wanted to, we started with D&D, and then we were like, why not just make our own system? We had so much fun tinkering with D&D that by the time we were done tinkering, it was almost a completely different system anyway. So we just leaned into that and we just tinkered with it more, created our own dice system, our own class system, our own everything, and just bundled it as a role-playing game. It was called Adara, a steampunk renaissance, which was funded on Kickstarter surprisingly well for how little I knew about running a Kickstarter campaign. But back then it was like, you just went with a dream and a prayer, and people backed. I go looking back at that campaign now, I'm like, oh my gosh, I'm so embarrassed by the way it looks and the video that I produced for that. But I was in college at the time, and it funded, and then so we were like, oh, now we have to make it, and to keep the budget down, we were going to do it all ourselves. So I did all the art direction, I did all the layout, I did all the writing. It went way over the budget. It went way over the time that we had set aside, because there's so many new skills we had to learn for that, right? And so I had to learn all those skills. I had to learn how to write a 280 page RPG or whatever, however many it ended up being. I had to learn how to write all that and how to manage it and organize it, and then do the layout for it and do the art, and all that. We had to hire graphic designers, we had to hire artists and manage all that. So I came out of it with a lot of these skills that introduced me to the Indie Game Developer Network. And again, this was very early in the life of the Indie Game Developer Network. I think there was maybe only 15 people in that network when I joined. And the person that recruited me was John Wick, who is a storied role-playing game designer. He worked on games like 7th Sea. He's and John and I go way back, but I actually met him completely by happenstance. I met him at Gen Con. He was there representing the IGDN, and I ran into him, and I'm like, hey, I have a game, and look, it funded on Kickstarter, and we got to talking, and I just, through that conversation, I just realized there was so much I had to learn, and so many of the skills that I had to learn or things that I had to figure out myself. There were people out there that already knew those things, that already had those answers, and so I immediately told John I wanted to apply, and he kind of got me through that process, and I was, voted in. I think nowadays it's probably a little bit harder to get in because I literally hadn't even produced the first book. It had just been funded on Kickstarter, and I was in the middle of actually producing the book. And then with the help of the IGDN, they were instrumental in getting that across the finish line, and just helping me with things like that. I didn't even how to design a cover, how to use drive-through RPG, which is where I did print on demand, how to format, having that resource. And still to this day, people that are members of that organization have that resource to ask questions and to get mentoring and guidance on how to do things like production that I never even considered I would have to learn that skill. But it was through the IGDN that I realized, well, I could do this for other people. I have these skills. Now I could just do it for other people. They could pay me to do it. And I started out really small, doing things like editing and layout for other publishers. And then, a few people in the IGN started asking for writing calls, and I would submit. One of the first things I ever submitted to was Call of Cthulhu, which is still a very popular RPG by Joel Sparks, which featured you as cats trying to fight against the Cthulhu mythos. It's a family-friendly, rules-light RPG, and I wrote some settings for his Worlds of Cthulhu book. That was one of the first paid gigs I ever had in the industry, and I loved it. And so after that, after I realized how much I enjoyed writing, that I started applying. I would just scour the internet, the forums, ask anybody that knew anybody that was looking for writers, and I did as many projects as I could. Some of them where I committed to way too much. I asked for way too little. There was a lot of learning curves that went into those early years of doing this. But I love it. There's no industry I love more. Something about writing role-playing games. It's so much different than writing novels, or I've written a lot of short stories, which I do love writing short stories and short fiction, but writing a role-playing game is creating a world and then letting people play in it. And that is such a fun thing for me. And that is why I still keep doing it to this day, honestly.
Yeah, absolutely. No, that's a very interesting story there. And yeah, I know there are probably people out listening who are, thinking about Kickstarter or wondering about Kickstarter. But yeah, things have changed quite a bit.
The landscape has changed. Yeah. I really don't think you could get away with what I produced. However, though, there's also way more tools to get a really good looking page. There's people that you can hire to run your campaigns, to take a percentage. Like, there are still ways that you can start with nothing and still have a really, really successful Kickstarter campaign. So when I say this, don't let it deter you. But organizations like the IGDN that do things like mentorship and put on seminars and present themselves available to answer questions and to guide new designers, it's really, really great. The mentorship program in the IGDN has really blossomed, and we do a lot of work. There's scholarships for new creators to come to conventions, especially conventions like Metatopia, which is a great design convention, a great playtesting convention. So we bring people out to these things and, kind of teach them, let them learn from us on the ground there, and we'll help with playtesting and design, whatever people need. We can do through the mentorship. And there's so many different mentorship options and things that you can do with the IGDN. If you're not a member, there's still a lot of ways to utilize that resource.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know just from some seminars and things that I have seen, Kickstarter, the tabletop role-playing game category in Kickstarter is one of the most highly funded categories, overall, I think.
Yeah, well, we've had some record-breaking Kickstarter campaigns on there. There's been some really good ones.
Yeah, absolutely. And I've also heard from Kickstarter itself, and they always say to email them if you're even thinking about it. Email the team at Kickstarter, even if you're just thinking about running a Kickstarter, so everybody can get some information there. Yeah, that's great. And I'm sure, like you were saying, things are totally different now, I'm sure. So because the internet, things on the internet change about every 30 seconds. So I'm sure.
And there's new resources, though. There's websites like Itch, where people can go on itch.io and they can crowdfund their own products, or people sometimes nowadays people just go straight to Drive-Thru RPG and they just put their products on there. They don't even do crowdfunding, and they just let people find them and discover them.
Yep. Yeah, I mean, that's exactly what I do. I haven't run a Kickstarter yet, but I just publish on Drive-Thru. That
works out really well. So
yeah, it does. I'm not swearing off Kickstarter yet, but maybe someday, but we'll see. But yeah, no, that's really fascinating. And then, you mentioned some of these jobs and stuff. You mentioned the game that you created. I have a number of follow-ups. It's do you still work with that game? And then I want to definitely talk about some, kind of what happened with that game. And then I definitely want to talk about some of the projects you've worked on.
Yeah, I come back to that world every once in a while. We did release a follow-up that was an expansion book that dove into the world itself and the lore and the narrative of the world. That was such a beast. I don't think I want to self-publish anymore. I'm just saying that. I completely self-published those two books, the Dara and the expansion, which was called The Traveler's Guide to Adara. That was all self-published. I did the layout. I did all the writing. I did all of that. And then after that, I did a game called Gears of Defiance, which was a passion project, something that a game I really loved. I did that with Gallant Knight Games, Alan Barr, who's a fantastic publisher. And I let him publish it with me, he did the co-publishing. And that was such a great experience to just be able to turn in a Word document and have that Word document turned into a book. Even though I took, the publisher, of course, takes their cut, and you work out a deal for that. But it was just such a smooth experience with Alan and with Gallant Knight Games that I was I want to go back to those worlds. I want to go back to Adara, but only if I can find a publishing partner who wants to help me with the publishing of that. Because self-publishing, I mean, it's definitely a thing that people do, and some people love it. I didn't love it. I love the work, the design work, the writing work. I don't love all of the things that go into being a publisher, the business side of things, the management side of managing effectively a company. I like, like focusing on specific project management, specific design work on that game, and then being able to pass it off. I don't, necessarily have to coordinate all of the art direction and, do the layout myself. Like, it's just good to have those tools at hand. And Gauntlet Games has a great team of artists and layout artists and graphic designers that can bring a book to life, right? And so it was great doing Gears of Defiance with him, and that world is not done as well. So there are plans to come back to Gears of Defiance as well. So probably both of those things will come back at some point.
Okay.
Soon.
Okay. And I guess before we move on to some of your other projects, I do want to ask a few questions about game design. So when you're tackling, and you can choose either one of the games you want to talk about.
Sure.
But like when you're tackling some of the, obviously one of the main one is the conflict resolution mechanic, or, what do people roll to see if they've succeeded, failed, or, in between, I guess, in some cases. How did you tackle those in those systems? Did you, some people use all the kind of traditional role-playing game dice, and some people stick to just one or two or something like that?
So for Adara, my first game, we thought we were being so cool. We were like, what if you had D&D, but it was a D12 instead of a D20? Like, which at the time you think you're breaking new ground. Of course, there's 1,000 games that already did that. But we didn't know, this was before I was really immersed in the industry like I am now.
Sure.
So yeah, it was fun to do that and develop that entirely new system. I really like the system we came up with for Adara. It was a D12 just to kind of tighten up the range that you could possibly roll. And we had like a rock, paper, scissors system where there was like 3 different, categories of like weapons that worked against armor, like magic worked against armor, or whatever. And like, it was kind of like you use that chart to determine whether or not you could get bonuses to your attack and something. So that was a really fun system, but it was still like, basically roll plus stat, which is what D&D is. Mm-hmm. Roll plus stat, you roll a die, you add your stat, you add your modifiers, and you get your total, and you compare it to a target number. That system is around because it works. Mm-hmm. There's a reason that D&D and Pathfinder and so many other systems use that mechanic. Now for Gears of Defiance, I kind of put together my favorite things of all these other different systems I love, and I made my own thing out of it, which is kind of what people do all the time. So I took a little bit of originally it was a Powered by the Apocalypse game. Mm-hmm. I was going to do it fully Powered by the Apocalypse, which is one of my current favorite game systems. But then I didn't, and I looked at games. And I pulled like from what was John Wick's samurai game, which the name of it is now escaping me. That uses dice pools in a really where you're combining these numbers to hit. So I took a little bit of that, and I took a little bit of like World of Darkness, trying to hit a target number on a specific die. So I took all these things I loved, because that's what you do when you write too, and that is what you do when you design. You look at other systems. Trying to design your own system completely from scratch is fine, and it's great. But all of these games exist, and all of these games are popular because they do something really well. And it's only every so often that we get a new game like the Genesis system, like used their own custom dice and completely came up with their own, dice system for what those symbols all mean. And that was very, exciting, I guess, ambitious, risky even, but it has worked for them. But I'd say like, for Gears, it was like, here's what I love, and here's how I want these other systems to work. Now, of course, like, if you flip into the front of the book, there's a huge credit section of like, here's all my inspirations, right? Here's the games that I played, the things that I loved that came into this. Like something as simple as playbooks. Like playbooks was a Powered by the Apocalypse thing. I don't know if they were the first game to introduce playbooks for your character, but it was definitely the first one I played that really popularized that mechanic. And now you see it in tons of different games. And I think that's important. You look at what's popular, you look at what people like, and you are kind of influenced by the game design ethos of the time. So yeah, I think from a mechanical standpoint, Gears of Defiance was just like all of my favorite systems combined into what I loved about each one of them.
Okay. And the game you were trying to think of is Legend of the Five Rings, of course.
Oh, no, it was not that one. Not that one. It was a small indie RPG he did. I don't want to type. I don't want to look it up. I don't want you to hear me clicking in the background,
sure,
but I will find it out.
Oh, okay. Because I know he's written for L5R.
He did write L5R, and he wrote 7C, and he did a lot of that. Okay,
cool. No, that's some interesting things, and I think that is your main point kind of there. For people who are trying to design a game, is that it's okay to look at games you like and steal from them.
Yes, and it was called Blood and Honor. That's what it was called.
Blood and Honor. Okay.
Yep. It's a fantastic narrative-driven game about playing samurai in Japan. So yeah, it's really cool.
Okay, I'll have to check that one out because I don't know that one. Yeah. Okay. But yeah. That if you're wanting to design a game, that it's okay to look at other games and
100%
take little bits that you like and see how to make them your own. No,
anytime I hear somebody say something about their game design where they're like, well, we're going to build our own system. I honestly have to say why. Like, that's my first, why are you designing your own system? Yeah. Is it because you've played all of the systems out there and none of them do what you like? Or is it because you think you're inventing something new, or you think that, being able, because most of the time what ends up happening is somebody invents a new system that already exists and they're just not doing it as well. Right. And you have all of these game systems that have open gaming licenses like Apocalypse World or Forged in the Dark, which is the Blades in the Dark RPG, or Fate, the Fate system, or Fate Accelerated. These are all things that you can use as long as you go through the proper channels and properly credit these things. You can use these systems in your games. You don't have to start from scratch. And even if your game, you start with a particular system, like I said, I started Gears with Powered by the Apocalypse. You start to find these grading points where you think maybe this doesn't quite work. And then you start to change one thing or two things. The next thing you know, you've got your own version of it, or you've got something completely different that was organically your own. But I think it's never a bad idea to start with a system you love and say, does the system work for the story I'm trying to tell in this game?
Yeah. No, I think that's great advice. I think, I mean, and it doesn't only affect, tabletop game designers or whatever, but I think sometimes we just get so excited, right, with kind of a new tool, right? And we're just like, oh, well, I'll make it on D12. I'll make it on D10. I'll make it on this. Right. And there's probably already a lot of games that use those other ones as well. Yeah.
That's exactly right. Yeah.
Yeah, no, but I think it is very important to make sure that the system goes along with your game. And as you just pointed out, we don't necessarily have to just reinvent an entire system. We can use some of the open gaming licenses and kind of run with that. And in fact, that's what I did with my really one of the first things I published was a game. I used the Open D6 system. So I used the Star Wars, it's basically the West End Star Wars game with some kind of updates from later editions that they had in there. I know that system, I could run that system from memory, right, without a book. So I just used the Open D6 system. And of course, I added some of my own flares, but I left, I would say, 85% of the system the way it was written in the Open D6 kind of license, and it just works, right? It just works. And I didn't have to spend, a ton of time figuring out skill systems or anything like that, or advantages and disadvantages, because they all came there. The little pieces I wanted to change, I changed, and then it just goes right on. So no, I think that's great advice. For people who are starting out, because I think sometimes, we can just, if you're not immersed in a lot of the games, or you've had your head down playing, your several systems that you really like, and then you kind of get this idea, it does benefit you if you kind of take a look around and see what other people are playing. And,
For sure.
I'm sure you'll find some, really interesting things out there. And one of the big revelations to me, a number of years ago now was like the Powered by Apocalypse stuff. I hadn't even heard of it for a while, but probably, I don't know, like 6 or so years ago, 7 or maybe, about 6 years ago, I kind of discovered it, and I was just like, "Oh my gosh, I didn't even know this existed." And that was really, really interesting to see the take that system.
Oh yeah, that game. The first time I ever played that game, it blew me away. Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. But now you have also gone on, you mentioned that you were writing for some others. You've gone on to work on some well-known properties that people would know their names quite well. You have done some writing for Star Trek Adventures, right?
Yeah, that's true. I start, doing all this freelancing. I've freelanced for so many different companies doing like so many different RPGs that I could name, but one of the consistent ones I did was for Modifius. Modifius makes a ton of role-playing games.
Yes.
They have a pretty huge RPG department. I was lucky enough to be on that team and to work on several different RPGs through Modifius. I worked on Infinity, the role-playing game. I wrote a few adventures and some thematic, stuff for Infinity, and then onto Star Trek Adventures, which was a lot of fun. I was part of the early team in that before the first core book even came out, and I wrote one of the starting adventures. I don't know. Sometimes you don't know where these things end up in, like which books, especially a lot of the adventures you write. And then I moved on to the Fallout team, and that's what I was doing most recently. Before the pandemic, I was working on Fallout, so that was a lot of fun. Fallout is a game that was near and dear to my heart. Mm-hmm. And so when they said Fallout, do you want to be on the Fallout team? I literally could have jumped through my computer to say yes. Like I could not respond to that email fast enough to be on that team. And so, yeah, that was a ton of fun to work on those Fallout books. And hopefully, I don't know, so I can't spoil. Hopefully that's not done either. But I know the pandemic kind of affected a lot of the production of games and things like that. So we're still kind of in a holding pattern, but I'm hoping to do more adventures and stuff like that in the Fallout world.
Yeah, Fallout is one of those. Speaking of the video game, Fallout is one of those games that, I'm an old fan back in the day of all the Mad Max movies and a lot of the. I'm even a fan of a lot of the ripoff movies,
sure.
From the 80s and even still into the 90s. Some and. Those video games were incredible. And I even went out of my way, even like when Fallout 3 came out, like I just bought like an Xbox just to play Fallout 3, right? Like it was like I wasn't even interested in any other games. I was just like, oh, Fallout's on Xbox. Well, I gotta buy one then.
Was so good.
It was so good. I mean, those games are so good. And it is interesting though, when you mentioned that you wrote for that, what is it like to come into a property that you're already a fan of and then just be like, hey, make up stuff for that? What does that feel like?
It's cool. It's cool on the surface. It's a lot of work. I think for those who don't know who are listening, there is a lot that goes into making a game for an IP, especially a corporate owned IP like Star Trek, like Infinity, like Fallout. Basically everything you send to them, you have to expect them to come back and say, well, this is cool, but we don't like any of this part. Like this part, we don't like this being part of the lore. Because really, when you're writing these books, you're establishing different parts of the world. Star Trek was probably the hardest one because there's so much years and decades, of Star Trek lore. And they have people literally at Paramount or whatever, CBS, whoever owns it now, that literally their job is to make sure everything fits, right? So you get sent back a lot of rewrites, a lot of things where you might love a character and they say, yeah, we don't really like this character because of X reason. Like, or you created this faction, we don't like it because we don't, for whatever. Like they have full appeal to edit and change your writing or to send back. Luckily, Fallout was not so bad in that. There was definitely some things that I wanted to put or some areas of the world I wanted to explore that we were told, no, you can't really include that. But I think people are, and this is not meant to be in a mean-spirited way, but some people are a little harsh on game designers who work on IPs, right? people are very quick to get online about how much, well, we hate this part or that part or what. But I don't think they realize when they're coming out online like that, they don't realize how much of that approval process can affect the final work. Like, sure, I'm sorry that your favorite ship didn't get included. There's probably a reason. It's not that the designers didn't want to. They probably did, and they said, no, we're not ready to have this in a book or whatever. Or there might be characters that have licensing issues, especially Fallout was tough because there have been multiple different companies that have worked on Fallout. So some characters are owned by some companies and some by others. And so you got to be careful who you mention. So if people are like, well, my favorite character wasn't in there, sorry, like that wasn't our decision. We would have had that character if we could have. And I think it's just good for people to remember what the process is like to work on an IP like that, because it can be difficult. Like it can be really hard to have something you love get cut because it doesn't quite fit into their vision of the world,
Yeah, no, I think that's always important to keep in mind. But I think, as fans, sometimes we get out of control, right? Because we have no practical reality, limitation on our imagination, right?
Right.
For Star Trek, I assume you can't go in and say Data didn't die in Star Trek Nemesis, but in my homebrew campaign, I can say, well, Data didn't die at that. Nemesis didn't happen.
Exactly. I mean, exactly. And you're at your table, you can do whatever you want, but it's tempting to want to tell those stories. Be like, ooh, but what if this happened? And then, and then have them shoot back and say, no, that didn't happen. Like, we don't even want that, suggested as part of canon, right? So it can be tough.
Yeah, no, I totally understand that. But I think some people, we forget, right? Yes. Yeah. I have no responsibility to a wider world or lore, or I have no idea that they're developing, a new Fallout game that's going to talk about this one thing, and they want to do that in house, and they don't want you to mention it.
Exactly. I mean, that kind of thing happens all the time when you're working on IPs.
Yeah.
They've got like a 5-year plan of like, what's next for Fallout? I have no idea, so got to kind of stick with that.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. And I know I've had some stories on the podcast where I had mentioned the Bill Slavacek interview where he actually created the name Twi'lek for that species in Star Wars because it wasn't named in Star Wars. And so he named it. He also created the name for the hammerhead species in Star Wars because that wasn't named either.
Is that Ithorian?
Ithorian. Yep. The Ithorian. So he created that for the role-playing game. He created Twi'lek because he said he got the information from Lucasfilm and it just said Bib Fortuna people.
Well, you're right. And I know that role-playing game and the card game, the Decipher card game, put a lot of names to people that were just like in the background. And now like that ended up becoming like official canon. Like and those characters had stories and novels and comic books. It's just kind of funny.
Yeah.
To see something you're not even realizing how big of an impact you're going to have on the world of Star Wars,
Yeah, no, absolutely. So it is interesting how it works sometimes. But I think you're absolutely right. We need to keep in mind that that the designers of Star Trek Adventures probably can't mention the USS Titan because it's going to be in the 3rd season of Picard or whatever.
Right, exactly.
But so working on Fallout, you were mentioning that you created some adventures in that, and
I want to. We haven't had any adventures released for Fallout yet.
Okay, so I'm sorry. You did adventures on Star Trek.
I did adventures for Star Trek and Infinity, and so I'm hoping to do some for Fallout as well because that's a lot. Writing adventures is a lot of fun.
Okay, because I wanted to follow up with writing adventures because, obviously. That's a huge part of tabletop role-playing games is the adventure. What are some takeaways that you've learned from writing, an adventure that, some other game master is going to pick up and try to run?
Well, that's a really, that's a
big question and we only got a few minutes left.
That is a big question. That's not something that I've like when I'm doing it, I'm not thinking about that at all.
Oh, okay.
I'm thinking of like, I grew up running it like, let's throw it back to the Star Wars D6.
Sure.
I used to like pore over those adventure books. And I loved that you could almost play through those books by yourself solo, just by saying like, oh, well, I want to go to the cantina. Look at the map. What happens when I go to the cantina? Let me flip to this section that says, oh, when you walk into the cantina, you're approached by a stranger, right? And like the way that those books kind of guide the story while also leaving players freedom to just do whatever they want. That's something I've always tried to replicate. Those early adventures that I read for those role-playing games really did, like, I think, formulate the way that I write adventures today. Because it's not so much of a script, like the players do this and then do this and then do this. Because when you try to write an adventure that way, it's not going to work. It's going to fall apart immediately, because the second players are supposed to go from part A to part B. They're not. They're going to go do something else. Yeah. Or they're going to talk to somebody, or they're going to like just abandon. So making a venture work and while not railroading the players is the toughest thing about writing an adventure. So what I learned about writing adventures is that everything has to have a backup, and the backup has to have a backup. Right. So if you have an NPC in the book that's supposed to come and introduce a quest, maybe there's another way they find that quest. If there's a piece of information that they're supposed to find by hacking into a computer, and you point and you're like, look, there's a big giant computer. And they're like, yeah, okay, let's shoot it. And they blow it up. You're like, no, you're supposed to hack it. You need to have another way presented to give that information. And while some of that is on the GMs are free to take whatever's written and do their own complete thing with it. Like, oh, that information there's a second computer in the room. They have that ability, but also kind of safeguarding that stuff into the adventure and still making the adventure fun. And so I do a lot more free form. If you read some of my adventures for games like Fragged Empire, which I worked a lot on that whole universe, or for all the different Frag books, I wrote a lot of adventures for that. And a lot of it was free form, as far as like, here's kind of the theme of the adventure. Here's kind of the thing that's going to happen. Here's kind of an arc. Try to get the players to follow this arc. But here's all these different ways you can get them in. Here's all these different ways you can suck them in. Here's all these different ways you can drop clues. Here's all these different places they can go to get information. So if they get 5 of the 6 pieces of information or 4 of the 6 pieces of information, they still have enough to jump from A to B without you having to literally like force them from A to B, right? And I think those are the most fun adventures, when players feel like they're not being railroaded, even though really, as the GM, you are still controlling that scenario. Your job is to tell a story and to get them to experience that story. But a really good adventure run by a really good GM is going, and again, a good GM can run any adventure and make it good, right? So there is a level of GM skill that's required here. But learning how to present that information just goes all the way back to those maps, those big, like the maps of the cantina. Here's the points of interest. And then there'd be a numbered list of like 1 through 5. I recently did a Tiny Spies adventure, which is a new role-playing game from Gallant Knight, their Tiny Universe. It's this whole spy universe, and you're playing as spies infiltrating. And instead of saying, here's how you infiltrate, right? It's like, here's all of the different ways you can infiltrate. You have to try to think of everything a player is going to do, and then even how to catch all. If a player decides to do something else, here's some ways that you as a GM can handle it. I think guiding the GM through how to run the adventure and like putting step-by-step instructions, like if they're off track, here's how to pull them off track. I just think it's so important to be thinking about all of that as you're writing. But usually the first time I write, when I sit down to write an adventure, I'm just concerned with the story. And then I'll go back and kind of pepper in that stuff as I think it's needed.
Okay. No,
I don't know if that answers the question at all, but
yeah, I don't know if my question was any good or not, but
it's not a process that I've really thought about. Like, it's always been writing adventures since I've played so many, run so many, and read so many that I've never gotten to play. It was a very intuitive process for me, at least.
Nice. No, and I really appreciate what you're saying there about giving as many opportunities as possible to get that information, or get the players to go to the, to the quest or whatever the situation is, because, I have certainly looked over or read some adventures and I'm just like, well, what if they go left? Right. It's like, what happens to my adventure, or, what happens here? So yeah, I really appreciate what you were saying there. Yeah.
Well, I think we both just answered the question. Really, if I could give one piece of advice to somebody that's out there writing adventures right now, I would say, read a bunch of adventures. Just go get adventure books from so many different systems and see how they handle it and run. So like, it's going to be very difficult for somebody to write a published adventure who has never run one.
Yeah.
It's not impossible, but I think it's going to be very, very difficult. So I think knowing the system is great, but being able to actually run an adventure, and also make sure you run your own adventure for people. Like I'm at a point now where I can play, like I have a pretty strong playtest process, and a lot of stuff I just kind of know. But all the early stuff, man, before I would submit, I would play test several times with several different groups just to make sure, like, what am I forgetting? What am I missing here in this adventure?
No, I think that's great advice. Now, one thing, I know we're about out of time, but it always brings up a question. What I usually, run my own stuff, but the times I have run, pre-made adventures, a lot of times I'll just mine the pre-made adventure for some ideas and then just kind of run my own thing. Because that's just kind of
fine.
Yeah, this is kind of the way I roll. But there is one time, the times I have run kind of a pre-made adventure, there's always sometimes there's always some flavor text or story text that is, sometimes that are presented in those that it's like impossible to give to my players without just like saying, and the crime boss who we're talking to goes into a, monologue about his dead father and how that led him to a life of crime or something. Right. Like there's always some flavor text. It's just like, I'm always just like, how do I tell my players that?
Yeah. And I think it's very, well, I mean, that's the key thing, right? When you're writing an adventure, like I've played adventures the same way too. I'm like, and I've been playing adventures where I get to the end and the GM is like, well, here's the thing you missed. I'm like, how are we supposed to know that?
Oh, yes. Oh,
how could we have found that out?
Yep.
Oh, well, if you had gone to this thing in this alley and found, and it's like, okay.
Yeah,
sure, but we weren't even close to, like, we didn't even have an idea about doing that. So you got to think about those things.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I've had that experience on both sides of the screen, right? On both, as the game master and the player. Yeah, the game master's like, oh, well, you missed this one thing, and you're just like, how were we even to know that the mouse had the key hidden in the thing without, since we didn't even go to that, one blacksmith shop or whatever it was. And it's just like, how are we supposed to know that? No, absolutely. But anyway, we are coming down here on the time. I do want to respect your time.
It's okay.
Yeah. Where can people find, some more of your stuff? What else are you doing? I know you're doing a lot of other stuff in addition to what we've talked about here.
I am. There's some stuff I'm doing on the side, some stuff I do for love of it. I work on a YouTube channel called Man vs. Meeple, where we talk about board games, because I do also love board games. That's a big part of my life and my hobby. And this channel is a way to kind of turn that hobby into more of a job. So I love getting on there and talking about board games. That's Man vs. Meeple. You can find us on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, Discord. You can find me on Twitter at Loremaster Ryan as well. I'm not super active there, but I've got a few projects coming out over the next, I don't know, so many months that I think are going to be worth paying attention to. So I'll definitely be tweeting about those things as they happen. I think one of them is actually being announced at PAX U coming up soon. So I'll probably be tweeting quite a bit about that game, because that's been it's been a project I've really loved working on and something I'm very excited to talk about. So as soon as that curtain is unveiled, I will probably be talking about it on Twitter a lot. So definitely follow me there if you're interested in what I'm working on.
All right. And I will be sure to put some of those links in the show notes for this episode at dicegeeks.com. So anybody who is listening right now, if you missed the Twitter handle and that, they will be in the show notes for this episode at dicegeeks.com. Well, Ryan, it was fascinating talking to you. I could probably ask a million more questions, but all that means is I should just reach out to you in 8 months or so and just have you back on the podcast again.
Save it for next time. I'll have more to talk about in 8 months, that's for sure.
Oh, that sounds awesome. Well, you know what? It was just a pleasure having you on. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you for having me. It's been a real blast getting to talk about things that I love for an hour, All
right, there you have it, guys. I really hope you enjoyed my conversation with Ryan today. We covered a lot of topics. I hope you learned a lot about adventure writing and how to split the party effectively and not lose your mind as the game master. As I mentioned in the show, I have provided links to Ryan's social media and some of the games that he has worked on in the show notes for this episode at dicegeeks.com. Head over there, check them out. They are awesome. All right. If you want some free stuff, though, head over to dicegeeks.com/free. And that's all I'm going to say about it. You'll have to find out. You'll get some mystery gifts if you go over there. Also, if you want to support the show financially, you can do so at patreon.com/dicegeeks. Everything is Dice Geeks around here, guys. Dice Geeks, Dice Geeks, Dice Geeks. Now, I thank you so much for listening. And until next Wednesday, keep gaming!